Welcome to Defending Digital. I'm Chad Werner. I'm pleased to have with me Bart McDonough, author of CyberSmart, 5 Habits to Protect Your Family, Money, and Identity from Cyber Criminals. You know, Bart, even before I finished this book, it quickly became my favorite book about personal cybersecurity. It's so specific and really gives practical advice like I want to share with others. So today I'd like to learn more about how we should apply these lessons from your book. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So you spend most of your time helping businesses with cybersecurity. So what motivated you to write a book that's for the individual consumer?
Yeah, so, in the past 2 years, I've done a tremendous amount of these end user awareness seminars for businesses. And they're about 45 to 60 minutes each. I'd go through, and most of the advice was around how to secure the business and how to keep all of the business assets secure. But towards the end of the session, it would always start popping up. Well, what should I do about my banking? What should I do about shopping? I had this question one time, and it really stuck with me. This kind of senior executive was going to go to their in-laws that weekend, and they're like, "Can I get on their computer?" And it was all this specific advice, and I just felt bad that I couldn't answer all their questions in the 45, 60 minutes that we had. So I started creating notes, and it started out that this entire book was going to be a PDF handout that I could give at the end of these seminars. And that PDF handout went from a few pages to, dozens, and then in the hundreds. And next thing you know, it was really a book's worth of advice and recommendations.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that. I used to work in IT, and security was part of my role, but it was in the corporate space. And we would talk to employees about their, the corporate IT security. But then, they'd always wonder, now, once I go back home, what am I supposed to do there? So I can understand.
Yeah, I mean, not too many people have IT departments at home, right?
Yeah.
Maybe if they have a spouse such as yourself that's well versed in IT, you serve as that IT department, but for the most part, people don't know where to turn. So I wanted to have a resource. And one conversation I had in particular with an executive out in Los Angeles, he was like, I just want to be able to turn to a section that talks about email security or that talks about how do I secure my photos. And so in the second half of the book, it's much more practical advice, very, very prescriptive. And so I wanted to kind of give that resource guide per area of your tech life.
Yeah, and that's very different than a lot of cybersecurity books that I've read, because a lot of them, you're kind of wading through, stories or just kind of, generalities, statistics, and you have to really dig for the parts that are, okay, now here are step by step what I'm actually supposed to do. So that makes it a really great reference. So let's go back in time. Yeah, what originally piqued your interest in cybersecurity in the first place?
So I've always been an IT guy. From college on, I've been an IT guy. And IT used to be, I would say, more challenging. And then it got to be a little bit more, there was a right way and a wrong way to do it. And kind of white paper design. And then cybersecurity kind of came along, and the threat became more and more real. I'm a hyper competitive individual. I don't care if it's ping pong or whatever. I love to compete. And cybersecurity combined, like my love of IT, there is a real competition going on every day with the adversary, with the bad actor. And it also, I think when we think about, is it science or is it art? Cybersecurity, there's really an art to it. There's lots of ways to secure that core asset, whatever that is. Lots of different ways to do it, lots of ways to defend it. And that aspect of it, that cleverness, really appeals to me. And then lately it's been, it's also about helping people. I mean, it's so many people are affected by this. I mean, it's really be hard to find an individual of adult age, teenage age and up that doesn't have a significant portion of their life online. And yet they don't know how to secure it. It's like the example I give in the book around, it's like living in a bad neighborhood and not even knowing how to lock your front door. And so we need to help people on these like basics. Right.
Yeah, I liked that bad neighborhood example, because that really makes it concrete for people. Is the internet is a giant neighborhood, and it's just naive to leave your doors unlocked, leave your windows open, because unfortunately there are those bad actors out
Yeah.
there, and if you're not defending yourself, then unfortunately you're probably going to fall victim. So
Yeah, for sure.
so in the book, you kind of built the book around these 5 basic cybersecurity habits. Now, out of all of these possible cybersecurity best practices, how did you arrive at those particular 5?
Yeah. So one, I wanted to have a manageable amount, because I think when you give people, here's 100 things you have to do, they do none. So I wanted to condense it down. And then when we look at like efficacy of these recommendations, I found these are the ones that, with the current threat landscape, with the current threat vectors out there, if people do these 5, and one lesson that really, it's not just doing these 5, it's doing these 5 consistently. And so if you do these 5 consistently, we think your overall cybersecurity posture consistently is going to be very high. Now, that could change in a few years if threat vectors really change, if people massively get away from email, or if websites start having a new authentication method, maybe it'll change. But for now, and I believe for the foreseeable future, these 5 are really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like you said, some people they see a 100-point checklist, and they just immediately are like, I'm not even going to bother.
I'm out. Yeah.
And then the other issue that people sometimes have is they think it's binary. It's perfect security or no security, other than realizing that steps that you take to give you degrees of greater security are worth doing.
Yeah, for sure. The most frequent question by orders of magnitude when I give these seminars and I talk about the 5 things, and one of which is use a password manager. And the most frequent question I get is, yeah, but it's the eggs in one basket. And I say, yes, it is not perfect, but with the current threat landscape, with the current authentication methodology, where you need to have a username and a password at all of our different websites. And on average, US professionals, the last I saw the data was around 201 different websites. A password manager is the most effective way to keep you secure so that you don't reuse passwords. We know reusing passwords is a bad practice. And so we have to go away from that. And so we have to go away from that. What is it? And so there's ways that you can use a password manager that are very secure, I'm sure, like you do, like I do. And there's some people that use a password manager that might be worse, right? If they use a very simple password, didn't have 2-factor authentication. But in general, it is a better, people who use password managers are more secure than those that don't.
Right.
But it's not, you're absolutely right. It's not binary. I say it all the time in the business world, there are no silver bullets. We work with some very wealthy clients, and sometimes they just want to write a check and say, I want this to go away.
Sure.
And it's, as much as I want to take that check, it's just not that easy. It's simply just not that easy.
Right. The 4th of your 5 habits is install and update anti-malware software. And you talk about iOS, just the way that it's built. There's not a need for anti-malware there, but Mac OS, the operating system for Macs, does. Now, how do you respond to people who say that because they're using a Mac or they're running Linux, they don't need anti-malware?
Well, I mean, I would just look at the lists of new malware coming out. I mean, the explosion of malware on the Mac environment has, from a percentage standpoint, has outpaced Windows over the last couple of years. There's just a lot more bad actors targeting that OS as it's gotten more popular, even in the last, 10 years, with the rise of Apple in general. The iOS, the reality is there's not an antivirus product that the iOS allows it to do its job. So they're all kind of window dressing. And Linux, Linux is an interesting one because there are not a lot of pieces of malicious code targeting Linux. There are some. So I think you make a better case for not having malware on Linux than you do certainly for a Mac. But I would still, as a best practice, install some antivirus, anti-malware on your Linux systems, but certainly on Mac systems.
Yeah. So the book is a great resource. I know you also provide a lot of information on Twitter. For anyone who's following you on Twitter, there's
Yep.
just a stream of learning to be going on there. Beyond those sources, what ways you recommend that people stay on top of digital security issues? Any particular resources that you'd recommend?
I really like searching on the hashtag cybersecurity on Twitter. I believe it or not, I think if you give that even a regular consumer, if you just give that a 5-minute glance every day, every other day, you're going to see kind of the top breaches. The reality is the large news outlets now are doing a great job of covering the very large breaches. I think that's a great resource. I use that a lot. I do some Google alerts on various cybersecurity terms. That might be a little more for the professional. But I really like Twitter as a good aggregator of news sources throughout.
Yeah, and I agree that mainstream media has been picking it up more. I mean, especially because so many people are using social media. Any breaches that affect social media, I mean, Facebook has been all over the news for the last year plus, and so any of those things that are going to impact the average person are going to make the news, and even other breaches that are just used by a lot of people are more and more getting the spotlight, and so I think people are waking up more to kind of security and privacy related issues. As it becomes less of a niche concern and more of a broader national and even international topic.
Yeah, one of the things I would say though that I think the mainstream media misses or the articles miss right now is we're still, at some point you could almost it's like a Mad Lib, fill in the blank of the company Marriott, fill in the blank of how many records were exposed, right? What I think is getting missed is how with each of these successive breaches, we all become a little less secure. There's a lot of studies out there around when I try to reach out to you and I know nothing about you, it's a pure phishing attempt, and it just simply says, click on this link because you graduated from XYZ university. If you never went to that university, you're not clicking on that link. But all of a sudden, if I say, Chad, I know what school you went to, I know what years you went there, I know what degree you got, if I start piling on other bits of data about you, the likelihood that you click on that just skyrockets. Mm-hmm. Because they know you, assume they know you. And so what happens with all these breaches is some of the bad actors and the more sophisticated ones are starting to piece those pieces of data together and present that to consumers as a through some kind of phishing or social engineering campaign, and they're going to be very highly effective. So while Marriott might not have impacted you directly as an individual, you changed your password, you did all that kind of stuff. The fact that they know where you've stayed and how your travel habits, if that can ever be used against you, game over in a lot of ways, right? And so I think we still have to think about how all these breaches, kind of can work together. The fact that they got my photos on Facebook, who cares, right? And I think that's a lot of people's attitude when they first hear about it, not knowing the incremental risk that it poses to them.
Yeah. And I mean, there is still a lot of apathy about personal cybersecurity. Do you think things like these breaches in the news are going to change that, or what kind of things do you think might happen to make more people care and do more to protect themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I think about a lot. Certainly, as I do these cyber awareness seminars, and certainly in the book, because at some level there is knowledge that we have to teach people what to do, and that's kind of the 5 things. But let's be honest, most people know they should have different passwords. Most people know they should have antivirus, and they should back up their systems. People might not know to use 2-factor. People might not know to keep their devices updated. However, they know that. So the second half of that equation is motivation. Is how do they get motivated to actually do it, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the constant stories, unfortunately, are an important part of that. and then, the other bit that I think will get people motivated is when they have a story, they hear a story that's closer to home, and whether that is someone they know, or, that someone they know knows, or, one of those kind of 6 degrees. And it starts impacting them personally. I still think people think this is a big business, big government problem, and not an individual problem. And it's increasingly, as you know, becoming an individual problem. And so going back to your original question, I don't think people are as aware as they should be, or as motivated, probably is the right word. I think they're aware, but they're not quite as motivated to take action.
Yeah. I liked how a lot of your examples in the book are specific examples of individuals, families who suffered some consequences of whether it was their own fault or whether they were simply a victim. And that really brings it home because, yeah, I mean, you see headlines and, 773 million, records breached.
Yeah.
If a person that maybe doesn't have as much of an impact on a person as the closer proximity of, hey, this was my mom, this was my neighbor, this was my friend. Even though the scale of people affected is so much different, it's the proximity. We just care more about people who are closer to us. For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why the book, I do try to tell those personal stories, and in the awareness seminars and the speeches, talking about how people are getting their life saved and stolen through this real estate fraud when they go to show up to their house closing and they got tricked, manipulated, whatever word you want to use, to wire their money to a bad actor instead of to their attorney or to the bank. I mean, it's tragic. And this stuff's happening every day. I mean, it's every day is this happening. And I think when people hear those stories, as opposed to, some government agency or a target, or just like you said, some report that it's 500 million or 700 million, like there's no difference to them, right? There's no emotional difference that drives a different behavior.
Yeah. So same question, but this time about privacy rather than security. So do you think people are going to ever really care about digital privacy? Is that going to get better? Is that going to get worse? What kind of things might make people care, particularly about the privacy side of things?
Sure, it's so interesting, and I watch the political scene here because I don't know how. I do think there's a minor groundswell of people that are kind of fed up with Facebook. You see a lot of people dropping Facebook, and I think we all have friends that are kind of saying, okay, enough's enough. I don't know if they know the dangers of what those breaches potentially cause. However, I do think there's an interesting opportunity here in an era of very broken government. While here we're talking and the government shut down, in an era of very broken government, I do think there's a chance for both political parties to come together and really take action against these blatant privacy kind of companies that are exploiting our data. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic is I don't think right now either political party has a say in it. I think they're both like, I hate to say anti-Facebook, but they're both like, what they've done is really wrong, and some of the actions are not proactive enough, not aggressive enough. And so I do see there could be a big legislative push at the federal government that gives us greater control on our data. Maybe like a GDPR that the EU citizens have, which I'm jealous of as an American citizen. I would love to have those rights. But so I think, coming to your question, do individuals worry about privacy? I think somewhat, but I think oddly the government might take action that would give us all greater protection. Again, I put it with a grain of salt considering how broken government is, but I am optimistic that that's an area that we can see some movement on maybe in the next 2 to 6 years.
Mm. Yeah, and so you and I are both working to inform people more about digital security, privacy, kind of get them motivated to take responsibility for themselves. And that's a good thing. But do you think companies should be working harder to handle some of these issues for people? And if so, what kind of things should they be doing?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, if we think about consumer-facing companies and that kind of bit, absolutely, they should be protecting our data. They should be notifying when our data is breached. And I think most of the large companies do a pretty good job on security. They don't do a great job on the response, right? So they don't do a lot of great stuff on incident response. So that's one area. However, I would say our government needs to do a whole lot more on the security issue. We talked about privacy, but imagine this, like and I'm sitting here in New York City, if a series of helicopters just flew over and parachuted a whole bunch of bank robbers and people were running around robbing banks, the government would have an immediate, swift response, right? At the federal, state level, like everyone. But that's kind of what's happening every day. Like there are people that are trying to steal from us as individuals in the United States every day through ransomware and other kind of malicious means. They are trying to steal from us from these real estate frauds, all of this. Yet our government proactively does very little. And I'm not suggesting they counter hack or things like that. I think there are other defense measures that we could put in place. And, I know there's trade-offs with privacy and it's a really complex issue, but I think our government needs to do more to protect the citizens from cyber crime. I think, obviously the privacy issues is something that I think the government will take on, but I'm not as hopeful that the government's going to help us in the area of protecting us from cyber crime.
So staying on kind of that topic of what individuals can do, what kind of things do you think parents should be doing to help their kids become more versed in digital defense? Is it important that parents help their kids become tech savvy? Do they need to teach their kids to be cautious or even skeptical when they're online? What kind of things do you think parents should be instilling in their children?
Yeah, the first thing, and I have two teenagers and an almost teenager, two 14s and a 12. And one of the things that, I try to highlight are when there are scams. The fact that, if you get an email that says Apple support, it might not be Apple support. If you get a phone call saying this is Microsoft, it might not be Microsoft. So there's just general awareness, I think, that kids need to be aware of, that there are bad actors out there posing as the good guys, as a legit vendor. So that's, I think, basic one is kind of, as I would say, it's overly technical, but the threat intelligence landscape. That's probably not the terminology an average parent would use, but to lay the groundwork. You might get an email with a malicious attachment. So much now with teenagers, they're not getting as much email as they are working on Snapchat or text messages or whatnot, but being aware that you could get malicious content there. And not to plug the book, but stick to those basics. Make sure you have different passwords. If there are secure accounts, turn on two-factor authentication. Make sure they're updating their devices frequently. Like they might not want to reboot their devices. They might, it might interrupt their Netflix or their Instagram, but you have to do it. And so when updates come out at my house, I say, okay, everyone's updating their devices tonight. Throw them in a pile. Let's all have dinner. Put our devices down. Let them update and then go back to them. So I think those are a few things parents should do without needing to be a cybersecurity expert. But, I think we take for granted that we know there are scams and frauds and out there, and we need to make sure our children know that.
Mm-hmm. So those are some things that a person can do to help children. Now, how about on the other end of the age spectrum? How about people helping elderly relatives or elderly friends? What kind of things should people be doing to help the older people in their lives?
Yeah, it's not too different. So I think what I have found is some of the elderly believe that when it says on the caller ID Apple, or when the person says Apple, they believe it's Apple. So I think trying to make them aware of some of those top scams, certainly the ones by the phone, we tend to see those are very effective as some senior citizens aren't online as much. So they might be less prone to a phishing attack as they are to some kind of social engineering attack on the phone. So making them very aware of that. And then some other basics. Make sure they have complex passwords. Make sure they have a password manager, two-factor authentication. Again, all of these kind of basics that we find that if you do consistently and regularly, your posture increases.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's really the beauty of, the 5 habits in your book is these are not things that you need to be an IT professional or a cybersecurity professional to
Right.
be able to handle. I mean, these things are meant to be for the average person who's, just trying to make a way through life online. None of these are too high of bars to jump over.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was the point. Right. But it wasn't, I mean, I went kind of the other way of like efficacy, like what's going to have the most bang for the buck.
Mhm.
And so we pick and then, but you think about it, they're not that hard. And in some cases, I would actually tell you a password manager, now with some of the integration in iOS and all of that, like it actually makes computing easier
Mhm.
and simpler in times as opposed to trying to remember which password was there. It auto fills it in or auto prompts you now on the phone. Like it's one of the few things with technology that makes you more secure and increases kind of that convenience. It's rare. Two-factor doesn't, right? Two-factor is a pain. Not that big of a pain, but it does add a degree, a step of difficulty or whatever. But updating your devices, it's more of a habit. It's just, you're not on your devices 24/7. Set it to update overnight, and you'll wake up to a safer device in the morning.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you talk about these being kind of cybersecurity hygiene habits, and in a way that's very similar. I mean, it's not fun to brush your teeth, but we understand
Absolutely.
that it's beneficial to your health. Exercise is not always the most enjoyable thing. Eating healthily is not always the most enjoyable thing, but
Right.
those things all help us to live a better life, a more healthy life. And so we're willing to kind of make that trade-off for convenience. And it's kind of the same in the digital realm.
It's really the same thing. In fact, we've been starting to use the term cyber wellness, right? And cyber hygiene, cyber posture, all those terms to kind of give that parallel, right? And it's, by the way, wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to lock our doors, if we didn't have smoke detectors, if we didn't have to have CO2, like all those things, what we do to give ourselves incremental safety, right? And people sometimes are, one of the arguments people hear or that I hear frequently is, and it goes back to your point earlier of like this 1 or 0, I'm either secure or I'm not, is they're like, well, if China really wants to get me, they can, so why should I bother doing anything? Well, I would kind of say the same thing about your home. If a militia wanted to break into your home, there's probably little you could do to stop them. But let's be honest, the most dangerous things that are going to happen to you are, a candle gets knocked over and starts a fire, and right, and your smoke detector is going to help you with that. Things like that are these basics, door locks and alarms and all these basics. They just increase your security enough that criminal behavior sometimes, or those common accidents that cause our property harm or our body harm, they go away. And you're exactly right. It's a very similar parallel in the cyber world.
So now, you've had a few decades of experience in the IT world, in security world. You've seen a lot of the trends in kind of the industry. Would you say that history has made you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of personal cybersecurity?
So it's interesting. I was asked this the other day. I think we're going to I think it's going to continue to get worse in the short term. So I would say I'm short term pessimistic, long term more optimistic. I think as one, I think the vendors, whether it's the Apple, Microsoft, and all of the website vendors, are getting so much more aware of it that they're going to build in some of these tools and capabilities and kind of force them to you. It used to be if you wanted to upgrade your Wi-Fi router, you had to take a deliberate action and go do it. And now that's automatically happening. I think you're going to start seeing those kind of things. Two-factor is going to be forced upon you by certain vendors. So I think we're all going to have our cybersecurity raised a little bit, but I think it might take a little bit of time. So I'm a little pessimistic in the short term, but maybe that short term, I'll define it as called 3 years, 3 to 5. And then after that, I think things could get a little better.
Sure. So there's a lot of buzz about artificial intelligence. How do you see that kind of fitting into personal cybersecurity? Do you think it's going to play a role? Do you think it'll be a net positive or a net negative for individuals?
I think in the short term, it's going to be a huge net negative. I think when I take, and you mentioned the 770 million email addresses dump that just broke, and you take the Marriott breach, and you take all these breaches, and I talked about, and if you have a really good AI that's looking at all those piles of data, all of a sudden I can dynamically create a pretty interesting profile of you as an individual. Mm-hmm. And so if I take that profile and tell an AI, go fish this person using all of this, I think they're going to be pretty successful. I think the phishing right now is pretty dumb, pretty simple, pretty static. And I think if you were to put an AI on it that could respond to you, knowing how you respond and knowing all of that, I think it could be pretty devastating in the short term until there's AI that is defending against it. But I think even AI with phone calls and phishing, SMS phishing, scams, smishing, things like that, I think it could be pretty devastatingly bad.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where that goes in the next few years, because there's always that cat and mouse game in cybersecurity, and then to see both the offense and defensive side using AI, and it just kind of interesting to see where that shakes out.
Yeah, it's a giant game of whack-a-mole, right? So it depends, and I agree. That's where I think usually the bad actors are a little bit ahead, because then the defense has to counter it, right? You're on defense for a reason, right?
Yeah. All right. So last question. Do you have any warnings, advice, encouragement, anything else that you'd like to share before we conclude?
I think, in addition to the top 5, and I would say one that I'd say for consumers to really think about is getting their credit frozen. I think certainly after Equifax, that's kind of on my next, if I had to have a top 10, freezing your credit would certainly be one of them. And I had to do something for my son's cell phone last year, and I couldn't do it because my credit was frozen. But while that was a little annoying and inconvenient, it also told me that if a bad actor is trying to take out a loan in my name, they couldn't do it as well. Mm-hmm. So it is a good protection. Again, not perfect, but it's a good protection. Also, I think if you're a business traveler and you're doing a lot of overseas travel, I think you do need to take greater precaution when you're in certain countries. Certainly China, Russia. The World Cup was just there. We had some high-profile clients travel there. I think you do need to be aware of that. And a simple Google around what should I do when I travel to these foreign companies, you'll find lots of resources. I talk about it in the book, but I do think just kind of being aware of those things, using a VPN can be very helpful, beneficial when you're on public Wi-Fi, things like that. A few different tips there. But generally my overall is be aware of the data about yourself online and know that it's going to be used against you. So Google yourself, check your LinkedIn profile, see what's on your public Facebook profile, and know whether it's today, tomorrow, next year, that data is going to be used to try to manipulate you to do something. And that kind of awareness, I think, will raise people's defenses a bit.
Yeah. And I know several of those items that you mentioned, the credit freezes, the traveling, those are mentioned in your book as well. So definitely worth looking at there. So Bart, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today. Again, this is Bart McDonough, author of Cybersmart, 5 Habits to Protect Your Family, Money, and Identity from Cyber Criminals. And you can find my review of the book at defendingdigital.com, and also have their links to buy the book for yourself. So have a great day, Bart.
Awesome. Thanks.